Okay, here we go. All right, welcome back. We are Game 3004 in the winter 2021 semester at George Brown, and it's Mobile Game Development 2, Week 1, Part 2 of our broadcast. And now we're going to be talking about Agile Project Management Best Practices. But first, let's get our link to the video up on Blackboard. So I'm going to go to Blackboard here, and I'm going to go, I put usually the video links up in under course documents in the week that I'm doing the video. So I already have one video from earlier, and I'm going to make another one. So it's going to be in here. And this is for your reference. I don't expect you to watch every video again, and there isn't a exam or anything like that, but they're there for your reference. So if you want to know anything about the course intro and setup, the project that I talked about before, then you'd look at this video. And if you want to look at Agile Project Management Best Practices, you look at this video. Okay, so that way, it's kind of compartmentalized that way. And it's in week 1. And we'll have other videos for the labs, the technical parts that I'm going to be sharing with you starting next week. Okay, so let's move on to what we're talking about today, which is Agile Project Management Best Practices. So that actually starts off way up here. So what we talked about when you did game production is how the industry's changed, and we've seen it this year more than every other year with the amount of crunch that's happening in the industry. And a good example that we were talking earlier about CD Projekt Red's Cyberpunk 2077 and so on, and how crunch really affected them and the conditions that they worked under. And part of that was their project management best practice that they used. And part of it was the pressure that they were getting from outside forces. And we'll talk about that as part of the project as well. So the idea is that we need to develop good project management methods. And you kind of seen some of this stuff in the development cycle when we talked about it in your first year and your first and second semester. Okay. All I'm doing is reiterating it here, as there are pros and cons as an example when it comes to employing different project management methods. The two most common methods are Agile and Waterfall for project management and software engineering. Nowadays, we don't do it this way. Waterfall project management, like we said before, is not something that is very common in the game industry and also in the software engineering industry. Why? Because things change so much. And a good example of that is we have a bunch of milestones, and then we're aiming towards a goal, and then we didn't quite reach that goal, and people are upset, right? I mean, that's just how it is, right? So this didn't quite work for us. And so Agile came along and gave us the ability for us to quickly iterate on our software engineering projects. And there's a bit of a different philosophy with Agile that we talked about before: individuals and interactions over processes and tools, which means, hey, let's focus on the people that are working in the team. Working software over comprehensive documentation, so less documentation, but let's get that a potential shippable release out as soon as possible. Customer collaboration is really around working with the player and working with your publisher and anybody else, whether it's an internal customer or external customer, over contract negotiation. Don't worry so much about contract negotiation. Work with the customer to make sure that they're happy with the project that they're getting, the product that they're going to get at the end. Responding to change over following a plan, because that's why it's called Agile. We're nimble. We're able to pivot. This has advantages and disadvantages, which we'll talk about in a sec. So advantage, we want to work our projects from a very high level of uncertainty to a much lower level of uncertainty. And this happens over the course of project development. We're here in La La Land, in prototype world, and then we're slowly going into pre-production, and into production we start getting more and more certain about what the game is about. Okay, that's how it kind of works. I'm not going to talk about these stages. You should know what they are. But one thing to note is that each of the phases of project management don't necessarily follow the first phase finished and the second phase started and the third phase, and so on. It doesn't do that. Sometimes they mix around. For example, the concept phase, we might be doing some concepting throughout the entire life of the project. Why? Because it might change slightly after we're into pre-production. especially when we get into production. It's going to change a little bit in production because maybe some of our elements of the concept might change as well, even as far into the game as post-production. But we don't normally see something that looks like this, a scheduled pre-production and / production model. We usually have some kind of mixing between one and the other, which we've talked about earlier in other courses. We want to find the fun, and that's why we do our prototyping. And we want to use different specialty roles like we talked about earlier. And that's what this inspired me to create the specialty roles for your project that we talked about in the last video. So what it looks like is more like this. We do an iteration. We're closer to the shippable build. Another one, another one, another one. Again, I would have loved to see this image drawn up instead of down. But here's where our goal is. But we've been continually pivoting because of different forces. We found that this feature was more fun doing it this way, or we found this aesthetic was better that way. And finally, we got to a goal, whatever that is. And we're happy. We're really happy with what we made. This is, again, idealistic. But the way, from an Agile project flow perspective, we have a product backlog. That is what they're called. The product backlog has every single feature that you can possibly think of that's listed in here. Usually the features are set up like user stories, and we give them to one or more teams to iterate and create a game. Okay? We have several phases, and different releases are part of each phase. And again, it's not exactly like phased in like this. There's a grayscale for sure, and sometimes one phase leaks into the other one because that's kind of the stuff that happens, which we saw earlier. So we work from a very chaotic state where we are in concept world, and then we keep working closer and closer so that our game idea becomes more understandable until it's very simple to understand to explain to somebody else, right? Because we've done all the concepting. We've done all the work to understand what the game is ourselves. So when it comes to Agile development, usually we do iterations of 2 to 4 weeks. Here in this semester, there's no chance you're going to have 2 to 4 weeks for all of your, or even any of your iterations. It's usually like 1 week because of our tightened timeframes. And sometimes we get that kind of thing happening. All right. I'm going to skip forward. But what we want to do is we want to look at the big picture. And the big picture kind of looks like this. We have our product backlog, all the features you can possibly think of in this entire in the game. You list them all. So one of your first meetings should be you getting together producers with your entire team and going, okay, so what do we want to make? Let's list all the features that Tom asked us to make for our base. Let's list all the features that we want to make for our specific game. Okay, cool. What are the features that we need to create for the first release, for our first playable release? Okay, let's pull those off and create a sprint backlog, which is a subset of the product backlog. Cool, let's iterate for about a week. Typically, that's how much we have, not 2 to 4 weeks. And then we'll have, instead of a daily scrum, a weekly scrum, a weekly meeting that we're going to do. And then we're going to have a potentially shippable game by the end. All right? It's not going to be shippable until the very end, but you're going to have something that's closer to what the final game is going to be. And here's an example, in this case, of a product backlog item and how you can break it down into sub-items. Okay. We also have something called the daily scrum, which is time-boxed. And time-boxing means that you only spend the time that you say in the meeting. You don't want to have useless meetings because it eats up a lot of your valuable time from a development perspective. And then finally, what you have over the entire sprint is something called a sprint retrospective, where you kind of look back and say, hey, how did this thing go? Did we do well? Did we not do well? What can we do better? And what do we want to not do anymore, right? Because that didn't work. Or what do we want to do more of? Because that really worked, whatever that is. That's your sprint retrospective. Each sprint also has a planning session, which we're going to talk about in a second. Now, Scrum is a special version of Agile. Not all Agile projects are Scrum, all right? Scrum is just a way of doing Agile. And Scrum includes several principles, which I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about: empirical process and control, self-organization, collaboration, value-based prioritization, and time boxing, which you've already seen, as well as iterative development. So that's your Scrum principles. And they're listed here for all their glory, for you can, if you're interested in reading about them on your own. One thing to note is we have several Scrum components, and I've just talked about some of them, the product backlog. I've talked about the sprint backlog, sprints, there's user stories, there's a bunch of stuff. And this is a great little 10-minute video for anyone who is a producer or anyone who's part of your team to watch. I recommend you guys watch this one. I think it's pretty good. And if you've seen it already, watch it again. I think it's a good refresher on what you need to do when it comes to projects this semester. So please take a look at this. Okay. And then we want to talk about the product backlog, which is a prioritized list of requirements or features, usually called product backlog items or PBIs for a game, a tool set, or the pipeline, or whatever you're making, right? And typically you have all these items. And what you want to do is you want to put them in priority order, things that you want to knock off as soon as possible, all right? Each of the sprints, what they do is we look at the product backlog and we pull off the items, only the items that we're going to be, producing for that particular sprint. And usually every sprint has its own sprint goal, and that you describe during the sprint planning meeting, which is what you have at the beginning of the cycle. Okay. I'm just going to keep going here. So your sprint planning basically starts off, you do your daily scrums and your development. And at the end of the sprint, you do a sprint review, and then you do a retrospective. Okay. So that's how it works. And just going to move here. One thing to note is tasks are estimated in hours or so-called story points. It really depends on how you want to do stuff. And that little video that I listed here in the PowerPoints kind of goes through all the details about how to allocate hours. An example would be you want to allocate certain buckets: 1 hour, 2 hours, 4 hours, 8 hours. Anything that's in between, I believe you go to the next highest bucket, right, for time, right? So you don't have like a 6-hour object or a 5-hour object. It's either 4 or 8 hours, as an example. Or if it's bigger than 8 hours, then it's too big and you need to break it down into smaller chunks. That's why they force you to think about things in story points or hours. Sometimes story points are useful because it's like the simplest thing you can do is like 1 story point. Something that's twice as difficult is 2 story points. Sometimes that's something that is, a moderate difficulty is 3 story points, and so on. And sometimes people use things like the Fibonacci scale. So instead of using 1, 2, and 3, they use like 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, and so on. Okay, as the Fibonacci scale works, or some other thing. So it really depends on the team experience. As you do more and more sprints and you work with Agile, you get better at it. One of the things that people do, and it's good and bad, is they almost sometimes, what they do is they're so entrenched in the waterfall project management concept that they do a little mini waterfall in their sprint. And that could also limit you. So be wary of this. Sometimes this sequential development model can work well in certain phases. Other times it's far better to do something that looks parallel, like this, right? So the parallel development model, where one thing doesn't really depend on another thing. You can design code and test different things and get more done in the same period of time. And that's why we have different specialists on your team. Releases are a set of sprints, usually. In your case, it'll be each release is 1 sprint, right? But normally that's how it goes. And typically what happens is we have a product backlog, which is all the items that you can possibly think of, all the features for your game. And then you have a release plan that includes 1 or more sprints. And you may have several releases in order for you to finish the game. The Scrum team has some special roles as well. There's something called a Scrum Master, a role called the Scrum Master, as well as a product owner, right? And that could be a little bit abstract, but think about the product owner as someone who owns and runs the sprint team. This could be your producer, right? The product owner, the person that the entire team is kind of working with and for. And you can see that the team is made up of programmers, animators, testers, audio engineers, and so on, right? And the designer. Then you have another role a lot of times called the Scrum Master. They're usually the coach that is an ambassador of Scrum, someone who knows the Scrum model very well and makes sure that everyone is following things like time boxing, their meetings, daily sprints. They work with the product owner across different product lines. So not just this product owner, but maybe other ones. And usually in different teams, depending on how big the teams are and how big the company is, you could have one Scrum Master per team. You could have one Scrum Master for many teams. Okay, so it really depends on how things go in your company. In our case, the Scrum Master is mostly me. I'm the person that's going to basically say, yeah, no, you should add, your backlog items to your Jira or your Trello. You should, you're not doing things right. You should do it like this. I'm looking for a burn down chart or one of those kind of things. But your product owner is probably going to be more of your producer. Okay. And they normally deal with someone like the publisher. Notice it says the producer is out here. Sometimes you have an executive producer up here. And you might have a studio executive up here as well, some other stakeholders, and as well as your customers, which are your, in your case, your players. All right. So there's all these other stakeholders that are part of your project. And what does the Scrum Master do? That's me. They ensure impediments are addressed, monitors progress, facilitates planning, reviews, and retrospectives. So that's what I'm doing for you. Encourages continual improvement, helps your stakeholders and teams communicate. That's me, right? And it can also be partially your producer as well. All right. Impediments are the silent killers of agile teams. So things like bugs that crash the game or tools, excessive or long meetings that don't produce results. This is why I'm asking you for things like your weekly reports or your peer reviews and those kind of things. And you should also self-regulate a little bit, which is part of the whole Scrum mentality. So take a look. Are you taking too long with your team meetings? Has the producer scheduled some of that stuff for you guys so that you're on track, or are you just running overtime every single time? Are you guys playing games during your meetings, or sharing memes with each other on Discord, or are you actually getting work done? Like, what are those meetings about? Okay, so also waiting for someone else to finish a task before you can start another one, that's also an impediment that we want to try and remove. That's why we try not to make tasks that are dependencies from one person to the other. We try and make it so that one person does all the tasks that are related together, if possible. The burn down chart is a great communication tool. And what it does is it kind of points to how your project is going. And if you look at this, it looks like this project, if I extend this line here, is probably going to run either a little bit over or just on time in terms of where the project is going to be. And this is something that drives a lot of the crunch that you see out in the industry. Why? If this is pointing to something way out there, this is a warning sign. What we want to do is want to drive this indicator. If you know that from here, we want to drive this back this way. How do you build a burn down chart? Well, it's a number of hours that you've spent, that you have left on your project every sprint day. So for example, if you have 600 hours total for the entire project, you start here, and then let's say by day 1, 2, 3, it looks like 4, you only have 500 hours in the project. You've done 100 hours of work over the last 5 days, and then maybe there is a big grouping of work, 100 hours of work in one day. So you can see that it dropped a little bit, and so you're back on track. Maybe there was some crunch over here. This is what this means. And as you get closer, you can see that this sprint looks like there's going to be some crunch. And unfortunately, this is the negative part of Agile. Agile also can cause crunch. Why? Because companies can look at that and go, guys, we need to really step it up. Tonight, I want you guys to do overtime so we can meet this deadline this day right here. So we're not overtime. And what crunch does is it creates stress, anxiety, and a bunch of other things that can be negative. And so I got to talk about the negative aspects of Agile. If this isn't managed properly, any tool can be used for good or evil. And this is one of those tools that can be used for evil. All right, it's just letting you know. Here is the ideal time versus the actual time. And we always want to try and get our actual time into closer to or underneath the ideal time in terms of sprint days. Okay. Task boards are another way of getting a snapshot or a dashboard on what's happening with the project. Usually task boards are split into columns. So here's all the user stories for my backlog. Here are the tasks that are now started. Here are the tasks that are in progress, and here are the tasks that are completed. These are the defaults or the bare minimums that you need. And also notice that there are these swim lanes. You can also have a group of swim lanes that are of related tasks. And those are the ones that you put inside those areas. It's really up to you how you manage this thing. In the beginning, we used task boards that were physical. So if you open this up, actually, you can see that it's like a board, a physical board that's, in your in an office somewhere, and they literally put these sticky notes. That's how it used to be. Nowadays, it takes the form of an electronic task board, and usually we use Kanban as our task board standards. And what Kanban does is it breaks it down into the following types. All right. So you might have backlog. So that's a column. And then we have our sprint. So our sprint takes elements from the backlog, items from the backlog, and puts them in the sprint, the ones that we're going to complete, the features we want to complete from the backlog. We have a to-do. So these are things that maybe we want to do. And this could be we want to do today. Typically, the to-do column and the sprint column, for us, we would merge these together. All right, because we don't have weeks and weeks to do our sprint. We only have a week. So typically this is one. Okay. And then we have doing, something that's in progress. That would be something that you pull from the sprint backlog into in progress. And each user is responsible for doing that kind of thing. And then after we're done doing it, we put it inside the verify column. The verify column is like a testing column where someone else other than the developer who's developing that feature is going to test that feature that they've developed to ensure that it's working according to spec. Okay. What happened with CD Projekt Red? Who verified that those features worked? And the answer is sometimes what happens is the verify column gets skipped and it goes from doing to done, which is a negative thing. And that's not what we want to happen. All right. As we go forward, we want to write our tasks in the form of user stories. This is, again, a great overview, like really high level is what I'm saying. So as a user, this is how we do it. I want to do whatever I want to do. For example, as a player, I would like to see how I'm doing in the game in terms of health so that I know that I need to go heal myself. As an example. So that could be something like a health system. As a programmer, I would like a tool to help me create particle systems so that I can make more special effects for the game. As an example. And these could be very high level, or they could be very specific. And usually it's broken down into user role, goal, and the reason why you want to make your user story. So there's how to write a user story here if you're interested, as well as some examples. As a player, I want to play I want a player mute button so that I stop being distracted by some of the other players online. Okay. Let's continue. And we have something called epics. And epics exists where it's a very large user story that can be broken down into smaller user stories. So here's an example of some smaller epics. Player control, where we want to have the camera controller as something that's a smaller piece. The player motion and weapons control. Those three things are separate little pieces. Looks like player motion still quite like an epic that can be broken down between player physics controller and input control. And then we have continual planning for sprints and for Scrum. We have our sprint where we communicate between the sprint goal and the release plan to make sure we're on track. And for each release, we want to keep in mind what our future releases look like so that way we can see if we're meeting our objectives. Tools. So there's different tools. One of them, which is fairly recent, that's been released and it's been improving lately. It doesn't even look like this anymore. Is GitHub projects. Actually, it's really improved a lot. It also offers flexibility for you to create a task board like this. However, and it also links to your GitHub issues. So there's advantages in using it there, and you can color code your labels and so on to really give yourself a sense of what needs to be done, what's high priority, what's low priority, and so on. But you could also use common tools like Trello and Jira, which I highly recommend. Jira would be the king of all agile project management tools, and it's something that's being used in the industry today. So I highly recommend that your producers think about using Jira. I know there's a cost involved. It's $10 a month for 10 people. There's 6 people on your team max. that means that it's still not going to cost you too much money. It could be the price of an expensive coffee every month, but you have a chance to do things the right way. There is a bit of a learning curve when it comes to Jira, just like any tool, but you get great reports. The dashboard is there, and you get full Agile and Sprint support, and I think it's going to help you with your project, especially with this one. And your CV, your resume, it'll help you with that too. If you haven't done Agile with Jira before, this might be your last chance this semester, whether it's for this course or another course, to do Agile with Jira. Okay, and one thing to note before we end for the day is there's two things. There's the Project Management Institute, which produces something called the PMBOK, which is the Project Management Body of Knowledge. It's a document that includes a lot of information about how to do things like do project management properly and so on. They also have something called a PMP certification. They have one that's specific not just for waterfall project management, but for sprints, for Scrum and Agile. So take a look at that if you're interested. There's always a room in the industry for more project managers, especially on the game industry side, right? I think there's nothing wrong. It'll give you an additional certification that will differentiate you between other people that are trying to get into the game industry, especially if your goal long term is to become a producer. I think it's really a great opportunity, and it's a feather in your cap, if you will, if you get certified with the PMI. Okay, and it's an international certification, if I'm not wrong. So other great resources are the Agile Game Development with Scrum, which is the book that I've taken a lot of the information from. So there's a lot more detail in the book that I can possibly offer in 80 slides, not even 80 slides, 50 slides or so. And this book is something that you can make last for an entire semester or two in terms of detail. So take a look there if you want more detail around Agile Game Development with Scrum. They have a lot of different examples, and they talk about the industry a lot and how things can be done, and give you some suggestions as well. And there's a link for PMI.org and Scrum.org, which has additional information about Scrum and Agile. So that's my talk about Agile project management. I'm hoping that that's going to help you guys, because I know we have a very busy schedule ahead. And I think one of the rules that I like to use is if it doesn't get scheduled, it won't get done. So please make sure you schedule your teams and you start plotting everything, because I'm going to be asking for it for your releases. So one of the release outputs will be show me a snapshot of your task board. What does it look like? Show me your backlog. What's left on your backlog? What is your sprint backlog? What have you developed this release, and so on. These are the things I might ask you for a documentation perspective, along with your video for that particular release. Okay. Okay. Any questions around sprints, Scrum, or Agile? Right. Hopefully this is informative, and it refreshed your memory on some of the tools and the terminology involved, because I think it's going to help you overall in your career. Okay, that's it for me. I'm going to stop recording this session, and I'm going to take questions. I know you guys, some of you might have questions around the project that we talked about earlier today. If you don't have any questions, then I'll see you next week. And what I'm hoping is you're going to meet with your teams. You should already have or be part of a group right now. That's what we did in the lecture hour. So hopefully you've already scheduled some time together and you figured out the best times to meet and started filling out that contract, which is due Sunday. Remember, Sunday the contract is due. And then you're going to come up with your team introduction that you're going to be doing in front of the entire class next week on Thursday. And again, I'll send out a reminder of you guys, kind of registering for when you want to do that. I'll give some slots in the morning, some slots in the afternoon, and some slots during our lecture hour for you guys to produce. If, for example, a lot of you have a mixed team of people from both sides. Okay, so that's what the plan is for next week. Any questions at all before I stop recording? Okay, I'll stop recording this. For the people who are watching on YouTube, see you next week. For the people that are here, I'll take any questions you may have. All right, so I'm not recording anymore.